When was the last time you found yourself in that proverbial pit? You know, that place that seems so dark that you can't even imagine that the light is still shining. It could be any number of things, and we probably all understand what I'm talking about, I would imagine, that we all have pits that we've been in our lives. And as I thought about that for myself, I kind of went through over the last couple days a few different things in my mind that seemed like it was a pit that I could not climb out of, or at least I did not know how to, and didn't know if there was even a way to. Some of that was even when I was a child, as my parents divorced and went separate ways. That felt like a pit that I had no way out of. I had no control in the situation, had no way to see how it would resolve. All things seemed lost and destroyed as a child. Even as an adult, and I looked back at my life as I studied to be a scientist and looked at the end of a long, detailed science education and got on the other side of it and went, this is not where I want to go in life. This is not what I'm called to do. And to look back at that time and see that as a pit and going, why in the world did I have to go through all that to be on this side? And other things. Even Jennifer, when she was very ill many years ago with meningitis, and it looked like she would not live through it. And I played over and over in my mind how I would tell our little children that mommy was gone. That seemed like a pit that was insurmountable, a pit that I just could not figure out where in the world the light was. It seemed so dark and so broken. We've all had these pits, every one of us. They're different, but we've all been in that place where we just couldn't see it. But on the other side of it, though, I know that all of those things that seemed insurmountable and seemed dark and like it was only destruction have also made me who I am. You see, there's hope in these stories. Your story is different than mine. You have your own proverbial pits that you've been in life. And some of you today, you are in one right now. And you don't see that there's any light. You just can't see that it's there. You can't fathom that it will resolve in the way that you want it to resolve. Many of us are in that place. Jesus even makes it clear, by the way. He says, in this life, in this world, you will have trouble. But take heart. I've overcome the world. But there's hope in this story. And today I want to tell you a story about hope. A story about hope that when someone was in literally the pit, in the darkest, deepest place where there was no light to be seen and all hope seemed lost, hope still was there. That there were trials, but triumph was coming. That there was something that was vicious, but there was a victory right around the corner. There's a story of hope to be told. And it's a story that should make us excited, smile. And it is a story that goes beyond the bedtime story, which is the series that we've been talking about as we started here a couple of weeks ago. To look at these Bible stories that many of us have read, and we've read to our children, and we read it in a kid's book. It's a couple of pages, and we see the story and go, that's nice. And we forget that those stories are relevant and applicable today, but we've got to go beyond the bedtime story and look deeper and understand why these stories mean something and why these stories teach us something about who we are and who God is and how to get out of the pit and to have hope when you're there, because it is a condition of humanity that we will find ourselves there. Again, Jesus promises that we will have those pits in life, but there's hope. And so today I want to tell you the story of hope using the story of Joseph. Joseph has an amazing story to tell. It's one of the biggest stories actually in the Bible. It is 14 chapters in Genesis, which is amazing. And it is the story that finishes Genesis and moves us into the story of the Exodus. But there's so much to tell. And so if you have a Bible, I want to encourage you to go to Genesis chapter 37. Now, Genesis is the very first book in your Bible. And so you should be able to find that one. So start at the beginning, find chapter 37. Now, here's the deal. I cannot even imagine how long it would take me, Spencer Dunlap, to do an expository sermon on 14 chapters. I think it could take me a year. So I'm not going to go through each verse. I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to tell some of the story, and I'm going to read some of the story, but all together, pull it together. And so I want you to follow along with me, but we're going to start in chapter 37, and here's where we begin in verse 3 with this statement. Now Israel, this is Jacob, by the way. Now Jacob loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. Stop there. This is where our story begins. Happy Father's Day. Don't play favorites with your kids, right? Because we wouldn't have the rest of the story. 14 chapters would just be missed if this verse didn't exist, where Jacob has 12 sons, and he decides he's going to make Joseph his favorite. And he favors Joseph above all others. This is the beginning of the story. This is the first pit that at least the brothers find themselves in, looking at their brother Joseph, who is the favored one. King James Version would say that this was a multicolored coat or something to that effect that he had. It was a coat of many colors. New Revised Standard Version says it was a tunic that had lots of decorations on it, a very colored coat. Either way, whatever the coat was, it was not a working man's coat. This was a coat of nobility. It was a coat of honor. And Joseph, child number 11, has it, and his brothers hate his guts for it. Verse 4, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Have you ever been there? Where someone had the blessings in some way. Their life seemed blessed beyond measure. They had all the material goods, or it seemed like there were blessings there that you just couldn't comprehend. How did it make you feel? And you look at your own life and say, what is the deal? Why didn't I get those blessings? Why didn't I get that? And maybe that was in your own family, but maybe it's just in general as you drive down the road and look at the houses or the cars and you go, why is that? And sometimes our reaction is we want to hate those people where, in fact, probably who they should have been mad at is who? The dad. But they're mad at Joseph. They hate Joseph for it. In verse 5 it says, then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brother, they hated him even more. So here's the storyline. In chapter 6, or chapter 37, verse 6, Joseph decides to tell them about this dream he had. And he says, please listen to the dream that I have. And now he goes on to tell them about how they are going to bow down to him one of these days. Now, I don't know exactly why Joseph decided to tell that story to his brothers. Maybe it was just out of immaturity. It says he was 17. No offense to those who are 17 and younger. But maybe it was immaturity that he decided, hey, guys, guess what? I had a dream. You are going to bow down to me someday. Don't you like my coat? You know, that kind of thing. I don't know why he would have said this, but he does say it. And they hate him even more. Maybe it was pride. Maybe the reason they hated Joseph so bad is he walked around going, hey, look at your jacket. Oh, look at my jacket. You know, I don't know. It doesn't tell us that. But Joseph was hated by his brothers. And then he has another dream where even the parents are going to bow down and they're all freaking out. Verse 11 says they were jealous of him. And let me just stop there for a moment and say, sometimes the pit we find ourselves in is a pit of jealousy. That we're so jealous about the things that are around us, we can't even see the light. We can't even see hope on the other side. We're so jealous. Or maybe for some, the pit is anger and hate. Do you think anger and hatred could be a pit that we find ourselves in? Literally a pit that we cannot climb out of. That we just cannot get past it. We cannot get out. We don't see a way of escape. We don't see light. All we see is darkness and hatred. Anybody ever been there? Most of us have at one time or another. And they hate Joseph. They hate him. In verse 18 then, if we go down the line a little bit, when they see him from a distance, this is the brothers, before he came close to them, they plotted against him to kill him. They hate him so bad, they want him dead. In fact, what they go on to say is, here comes the dreamer. And then they go on to say, let's see what will become of his dreams in verse 20. If we kill him, let's see who bows down to who. Let's see what happens with this guy. But Reuben has a little sense of sanity. And he says, you know what? Why don't we, instead of killing him, we'll just, get rid of him for a while. We'll throw him into this pit over here. Now, Reuben intended to come back later and rescue him, but still it was an option for them. And so they decide to do that. And so they strip him down of his pretty robe, and they kill a goat. They soak the robe in blood and take it back to the father to go, look, your son is no more. A wild beast got him and killed him. Now, this is a pit for Jacob, the loss here of his son. But they hate him this bad. But listen to verse 25, what it says. And they sat down and ate a meal. They have no remorse at all. They decide not to kill him at least, but they throw him into a pit. And they sit down and have lunch. These people hate this guy bad. They want him gone. And so they come up with a bright idea. Let's sell him into slavery. And that's what they do around verse 27. And so they begin that process. But let me stop and take a step out of the story for a minute. And let me ask you this question. Do you think you can find the blessings in this pit? Do you think Joseph can find the blessings in that pit? Is Joseph blessed by the pit? The answer is yes. Why? Because the alternative was death. They really intended to kill him. The pit is the means of his salvation. The pit is the means of his escape. And that's the thing we just fail to see sometimes, that when we're in the pit, sometimes that may be the very thing that saved us. But we get so angry about the pit that we don't see that it could have been worse than that. And I'm not just trying to do that pie in the sky, everything's right, but I mean, we see stories all the time. Like on September 11th, just for an example, with the World Trade Center. You've read those stories, haven't you, where something happened, the car wouldn't start that morning. And so by the time they got the car jump-started, they were late to work, and they were so late that the building had already collapsed. Now, in that moment, that person who couldn't get their car to start may have been cursing at God. Why in the world won't you let my car start? I'm going to be late for work. I'm going to lose my job. Blah, blah, blah. But it was the means of salvation. See, we just miss that sometimes. That this pit that Joseph finds himself in is life. And so they take his tunic, they go and do that thing with the dad. They deceive the deceiver. Jacob was the deceiver. If you know that story from the past, they deceive the deceiver. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. In verse 36, the Midianites then sold Joseph again. So Joseph is sold into slavery, and they decide to sell him again to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And so we have Joseph now, who's hated by his brothers, stripped of his robe, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, now sold again, and he's on his way to Egypt, which is not a good place to go. We move over to chapter 39 then. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And listen to verse 2, it's wonderful. And the Lord was with Joseph. You see, sometimes we just fail to see the invisible hand of God at work. Was God at work in the story? Yes. Did Joseph see it? I don't know if Joseph saw it. I don't know. I don't know if in the pit he went, well, God, here we are in the pit again. Here we are in slavery. Here we are in... But I trust you still. I don't know if that was his heart. I'm not sure. It doesn't really say, although we get some clue that he really knew that God was still there and at work, which I love that. But then we put ourselves in the story and we go, but how would I respond now? My brothers hate me. They sell me, or they throw me in a pit. They're going to kill me, first of all. They throw me in a pit, sell me into slavery, and then I get sold again, and I'm on my way to Egypt. How would I be talking to God? What would I be thinking? And what does this mean anyway? The Lord was with Joseph. It just means he was not absent. He was not uncaring. He wasn't far off. He was there. He was still moving, even though Joseph may not have seen it. And so Joseph then is taken into the house of Potiphar, the chief of the bodyguards, and he ends up becoming the master of the house. He ends up being entrusted with it. Why? Because everything that Joseph touched was blessed. And Joseph in his life was able to bless Potiphar and all that was there, and they saw it, and he saw it. And it says in verse 5, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house on account of Joseph. And they knew it. They knew it was because of Joseph. And so it was so much so that he gave the authority to Joseph. In verse 6, it says, Potiphar didn't worry about anything except eating food. Now that is a job I'm looking for. Anybody else? 4 of you want that job? Hey, you can go do all the work. I just need to worry about eating. I'll be over at the buffet. You go ahead and do everything else. Potiphar's got a good gig going on here. And here's the thing. Joseph is a blessing to Potiphar, even in captivity. Now, this begins to blow our mind, I think. We think that if we were captive and we're slaves and we're in all this, turmoil and trouble, it would probably be the last thought on our mind to bless our captors. But it's so interesting. You see that as a running theme all through Scripture, is that is the call of a disciple, a follower of God. And just we see over even with Abraham in Genesis 12, just a little bit before this, that Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. Now we see it right here in Joseph, that God is blessing Joseph with skills and abilities, probably the very skills and abilities that Joseph needs to learn right now in captivity so he can do what he does at the end of the story. That these trials become his teaching ground for how he is to rule and to lead. Isn't that true in your trials sometimes, don't you think? That we learn things and we experience things in these trials that down the road teach us how to function better. That we learn something in this moment to be a blessing to someone else, to teach someone else, to do something that has even more meaning than when we're in this pit. And this is what happens with Joseph. Joseph is blessed and he passes on the blessing. Is it possible that Joseph could have said, Potiphar, I'm not interested in running your house. I'm not going to do any of it. Of course, he would have died, but he could have said, no, I refuse to bless you. I refuse to give that blessing away. But he doesn't, and he's blessed. But he has a problem. Joseph has a terrible problem, and it is he's good looking. And this gets in the way of what's about to go down. And so in verse 6 at the end, it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. In verse 7, it came about after these events that his master's wife, that's Potiphar's wife, looked with desire at Joseph, and she wanted him. He knew it wasn't right. Basically, Joseph's response is, look, I have authority over everything except you, and we're not going to go down this road. And then Joseph makes a mistake, though, and that is in verse 11, he ends up alone in the house with her. You see, sometimes the best way to protect ourselves is to be smart, and Joseph finds himself alone when none of the other men are around, and she comes after him again, and she, in verse 12, caught him by his garment as he's literally running. By the way, sometimes that when you are tempted to sin, the best way is to just run. And this is what he does. He hightails it out of there, but she grabs his tunic, rips it off of him, and this is the second time that Joseph has lost his robe. The first time in the pit, and the second time in what will become another pit for Joseph. And she tells her husband, Potiphar, the captain of the guard, this slave, this guy that you brought in, tried to lie with me, and here's his robe, see? In verse 19 of chapter 39, it says that Potiphar's anger burned. Now, if you make the anger of the captain of the guard burn, you're in trouble, right? But what's interesting is that he doesn't kill Joseph. I'm guessing, like you, if you were the captain of the guard, you probably have a conceal and carry permit for a sword. And he has the authority to kill Joseph and chop him up in little pieces if he wants. He owns him. Wouldn't you think that might be the natural conclusion of the chief bodyguard for the Pharaoh, to just chop Joseph up? But instead, he throws him in jail. And once again, although jail may seem like the worst pit ever, the jail ends up being Joseph's salvation. Once again, the pit saves Joseph. And Joseph flourishes there, and the jailer is blessed because of this blessing. He should have been dead, but the jailer sees that Joseph has something in him that is amazing, and the jailer decides all he wants to do is sit around and eat too, I guess. It doesn't say that in the text. And so Joseph ends up doing all the work in jail as well. And then God brings a couple of people to jail to spend some time with Joseph, who's in charge of the jail. Again, question, do you think Joseph sees the blessing of being in jail and running the jail while he's in jail? I don't know. Would you? Would you see that this was the means of salvation, even though it seemed not like what you had planned? I'm sure Joseph, if he told his story, would not have said, Mom and Dad, I plan to graduate from high school and go into the pit, sold into slavery, sold again, run Potiphar's house, run the jail, and I'm sure this was not his plan. But again, the pit is what saves Joseph. Saves him from destruction. And so now we see in chapter 40 then that Pharaoh gets displeased with a couple of his employees, the cupbearer and the baker, and he throws them into prison. And now Joseph gets to decide, will I continue to bless these guys as well? And what gives my mind pause is that 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 passage that says that God is the God of comfort who comforts us in our trials. Do you think God was comforting Joseph in these trials? I know he was, because it says in verse 2 and it says again in verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph had to know that God was working here. And so Joseph has a choice. Am I going to bless them with the same blessing that I received? God is a God of comfort who comforts us in our trials so that we can comfort others with the same comfort that we got from God. And Joseph does this. They both have a dream. The cupbearer and the baker, they have a dream. They can't figure it out. And Joseph is there to comfort them and to give them the interpretation, and he does. Now, the bad news for the baker is it's not going to end well. He's going to lose his life. But the cupbearer is going to be restored. And Joseph says, look, all I want in return is don't forget me. When you get out of here, remind them about me. And what happens? He forgets about him. And he stays in the pit. And let me just stop there and say, Joseph's in that pit for a couple more years. God's timing is not always our timing. We want out of the pit. We always want out of the pit. But sometimes God has a plan for something amazing down the road, and we need to be patient. And it is one of the dirtiest words in the English language, to be patient, don't you think? But he has 2 more years to wait it out. Can Joseph continue to see the blessings in jail? And let me ask you, how would you be responding to God now? Again, the story of Joseph. Would we be screaming at God, saying, what is the deal? You gave me the interpretation of the dream. We got it right. He got out. I asked him not to forget me. He obviously did. All hope is lost. Another pit. Woe is me. Or does Joseph believe that God still got it? Pharaoh has a dream, and he can't figure it out either. No one can. And finally, the cupbearer remembers. This is chapter 41. The cupbearer remembers, oh yeah, there's this guy I met in jail. Maybe he can help you out. And so get him all cleaned up, and he comes in, and Pharaoh says in verse 15, I have heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. In verse 16, Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. I love that. You know why? Because Joseph is still glorifying God in the pit. He still knows that God's got this, God's in charge, God's got the power, and he can pull this off. And Pharaoh believes him. He's able to interpret the dream. There's going to be 7 years of plenty in the land, and then there's going to be 7 years of absolute poverty, and everyone's going to die unless you prepare in the 7 years of plenty and make sure that it's all right. And it tells us over in chapter 41, verse 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you above all the land of Egypt. What's happened again? Joseph once again is elevated, and he's the number 2 guy in the kingdom. No one can tell Joseph what to do except Pharaoh himself. A ring on his finger, he gets the second chariot. He is the man. He is the manager of all things. He is in charge to accomplish what vision God showed him the interpretation of. And so we see Joseph's life like this, up and down, in the pit, up to prominence, in the pit, up to prominence, in the pit. Don't you see it? And I know some of you think your life's the same way. Roller coaster, over and over. But Joseph, every time he's in the pit, God says, I was with him, I was there, and we see him go from slave to prime minister, just like that. No one would have seen it. And we see down in verse 52, Joseph understands that God was at work because when he names his child Ephraim, it says, it means God has made me faithful in the land of my affliction. That he was still faithful and fruitful, that he's made me fruitful. All these things have come out, they've borne this good fruit, even out of the affliction. That God was able to take my very worst and make the very best. In the pit, there was still light. And I just got to tell you, the image I continue to see in my head is that idea of, being on an airplane and taking off in a storm. Anyone ever been there? Anybody ever been in an airplane taking off through a storm? It's scary. But then there's this one moment that you break through the clouds and all you see is sun. Anybody ever seen that? It's amazing. This is the story. That we may not see that the sun is there in the middle of the storm, but the sun is there. The sun is there. The brightness is there. Life is there. Hope is there. You know as well as I do, no matter how bad the storm is, the sun is still shining, right? You know that. The question is, do you trust God that He is still at work even when you're in the pit and you don't see how it could possibly work or how you could possibly climb out? Do you trust God is still there even though I may not see Him? This is the story that we see over and over and over again. And so Jacob then has his 11 sons. The food is gone. Joseph was right. The famine is here. And Jacob tells his sons, go to Egypt and get some food because otherwise we're going to all starve to death. And so the sons head off on the journey. Not Benjamin, not the youngest one. Jacob's a little overly protective of the youngest one, probably because of what happened to Joseph. And so he sends the sons on, and they come to Egypt. In verse 6, then we see this. It says in chapter 42, verse 6, now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Stop. What was the very initial thing that got this kicked off besides the colored coat? My dream. Oh, I had a dream. Nice coat, huh? You'll all be bowing down to me. Here it is. And they see it. And when Joseph, verse 7, saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. Maybe 20 years has gone by at this point. They don't recognize Joseph, but he recognizes them. He speaks harshly to them, and he said to them, where have you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. What would you have done, though, in this moment? Let's stop there. Let's put ourselves in the story. You're Joseph, number 2 guy, number 2 chariot, ring on your finger. No one can tell you what to do except Pharaoh. They're bowing at your feet. Here we are. We don't recognize you. Anybody else got this in mind? Boonk. Or, hey, guys, I need some help over here. See these 10 guys right here? Dead. They need to go. I don't know. How would you react in that? I'm just telling you, not how I would react necessarily. Yeah, probably. Okay, let's be honest. They need to die, don't you think? This is what's going on. But in Joseph's mind, he knows that God has had this the whole time. They don't need to die. Why? Because it wasn't even about them. It was about what God needed to do through them. And yeah, was it terrible? Absolutely. It was ludicrous and terrible in every way what they did to Joseph. All of this was, but Joseph needed to go through this for whatever reason in God's mind so that he would be prepared for what's next. This is part of that story, guys. I'm just telling you, that pit, if we'll learn from it and allow God to comfort us and move in us from it, there is an answer on the other side. Now, here's the other truth. I just got to be honest. You may not see it on the side of life. You may not always go look on the backside and go, oh, I see why all that is, but often you will. Haven't you had those experiences? You're in the middle of the storm, we get past the storm, and maybe years later down the road, you look back and you go, now I see. Now I see. I did not see it then, but now I see. Like all those stories that I told about my own life, like for instance, the science one. Why did I go through all that education, all that, and now I'm a pastor? Guess what? It's because so many people that need to hear that there is a creator and need me to tell them about it. And God has blessed me with the ability to do it, even though at the time I didn't understand it, and even for years after it, I didn't get it. But now I look back and go, aha, now I see. But even if every trial is not answered at the end of this life, God will show us on the other side, but we have to trust him in the middle of the pit, in the middle of the storm. And so Joseph is here. He knows, yes, the brothers, they had nothing to do with it, but he devises a plan to be able to make sure he gets to see his dad and his youngest brother. Because Joseph wants to see Benjamin. He wants to see his dad. And so what does he do? He doesn't say, I told you so. He doesn't kick him in the face. But he does put him in jail for 3 days. Maybe that's just a little bit, I got to figure out what to do. And maybe that makes me feel a little bit better to put him in jail for 3 days. Either way, but in verse 21, they sort of come to their senses. And they said to one another, verse 21, chapter 42, they're freaking out, by the way. Truly we're guilty concerning our brother because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. They recognize that what they're dealing with is because of how they treated Joseph all those years ago. But really what Joseph is doing is he's orchestrating a plan to test their integrity, I think. This is my opinion. It doesn't say that necessarily, but I see it in here. And Joseph's trying to see, did they learn anything and have they changed? In those 20 years, have they figured it out? Have they gotten it figured out? And when Joseph heard them, by the way, he's speaking to them at this time through an interpreter because he's still trying to veil who he is. He doesn't really want them to know yet who he is. But he hears them talking and he goes off to the side and he weeps. These are his brothers here. But he devises a plan to figure out, have they changed? And we fast forward through a couple of chapters now as this story begins to come to its climax. And so he sends them on their way with the grain that they'd come for and with their money back, which freaks them out when they realize they have their money back. Because it's like, uh-oh, they're going to think that we stole this. So already we're having some issue. But the deal is he sends them on their way so that they'll bring Benjamin back. He wants to see the younger brother. They show up. He has a big meal planned for them. Now, if you're one of the brothers, you still probably are freaking out. Like, why would number 2 guy want to have dinner with us? Like Egyptians and Hebrew people, we don't eat together. This is really weird. But he has this meal, and they all get served, all of these 11 brothers, and Benjamin, the youngest one. Again, Joseph's number 11, Benjamin's number 12. Benjamin gets 5 times the food that everybody else got. Sounds familiar, right? Kind of like the coat of the favored one. But why? I don't know, but I'm guessing that part of what Joseph's doing is trying to figure out how are they going to treat Benjamin if I give him 5 times the food and I'm going to sit back and I'm going to watch. Have they learned anything from this? Have they figured this out? And then he has the next plan. Okay, so pack up their sacks with grain, send them on their way, and do your thing. But he tells one of his servants, now hide my silver goblet in the youngest one's sack. And so they all head off. They do that. He tells his servants to go catch up with these guys. And they go, hey, one of you guys has stolen the number 2 guy's silver goblet. Someone's going to die today, basically. And they swear up and down, it was not us. There's no way. None of us would ever do such a thing. And so they began to unload the sacks, oldest to youngest. And guess what? They get down to Benjamin, and there's the cup. They flip out. They had promised their father, nothing will happen to Benjamin. Nothing will happen. We'll take care of him. All will be well. All's okay. And they freak out because Benjamin now is guilty in the eyes of Pharaoh for being a thief. And you get over to chapter 44, verse 32. And Judah, whose idea it was to sell him into slavery. Verse 32, he says, for your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. See, Judah had said, he will come back safe. I will be his surety bond. In other words, if he doesn't come back, I'll take care of it or whatever. I'll be the one on the line for it. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad's not? What's Judah doing? He's doing something that we haven't seen in Scripture up to this point. What Judah's doing is he's putting his life on the line for Benjamin. It's the first time that we see a sacrificial offering of oneself for another person. We have all these relationship challenges all throughout. We see it starting with Cain and Abel and all the way through Genesis up to this point. But we don't see anyone step in and say, let them go free, I'll take the blame. But Judah does. And Judah says, I'll take the blame. I'll take it on me as this substitutionary sacrifice. It's the first time. And by the way, I don't think it's an accident that Judah, the tribe of Judah, is where Jesus comes from, who is the ultimate substitutionary sacrifice for you and for me. That Judah paints this picture from the very beginning. This is just how the way God orchestrates it. It was no accident that it was Judah that said, I'll take the blame, I'll take the guilt, I'll put my life on the line so that he can be free. This is what Judah does, and passes all the way to Jesus, who says the same thing to you. I'm on the line, I'll take your punishment, I'll die so you can live. And Joseph deals kindly with them. He doesn't need to hear any more. And he breaks down and he weeps and he reveals who he is. And I'm sure they flipped out, trying to figure out how this all went down. It takes us all the way to the end, chapter 50. By this time, Jacob and the whole family, all of them, have relocated so that Joseph can take care of them during the famine. And Jacob is there. He's overjoyed and amazed like anyone would. In other words, Jacob's lifted out of his own pit of despair to see his lost son found. And Joseph commanded the physicians and embalmers to take care of his dad when he passed away. And he died, and the brothers freaked out again because they thought, now that Jacob's dead, now Joseph's going to get his revenge on us. And so over in verse 15 of chapter 50, they pretty much make up a story. Like, okay, so Joseph's going to get us now. He was only nice to us because, our father was still alive. But now that he's gone, we're going to make up the story. It was, what if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father charged before he died, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brother and their sin, for they did you wrong, and now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Do you think they were telling the truth? I don't think so. I think they went, how are we going to get out of the jam this time? We're going to rely on our own human wisdom again. We're going to make up a story. Joseph, before our dad died, he said, don't hurt us. Don't beat us up. Don't cut our heads off. Any of that kind of stuff. He said so. Dad said so. So, hopefully we're okay. In verse 19, but Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me. Now, I love that. I got to just stop there and say, he doesn't mince any words here. He doesn't say, it's all right. It wasn't that bad. And he said, you meant evil. You did. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. You see, Joseph is still blessing instead of cursing. That the blessings that God had poured in through Joseph were still being sent out, not only to those who had him in captivity and to Potiphar and to Pharaoh, but now back to his brothers again, and we come full circle that blessing of Joseph is now being passed on, and where he could give death, he gives life. That they find salvation and life when they deserve death. But he says, what you meant for evil, God meant it for good. God was able to work it out. It's unbelievable. It's huge. It's amazing. What you meant for evil, God meant it for good. So what do we take from this? What do we do with this? Is this just a lemons into lemonade story? You've heard that before. When you're in the pit, someone will say, well, You just got to take those lemons and make lemonade. Is that the story? I don't think that's the story. I don't think this is a lemons to lemonade story. Instead, I think this is about having a new perspective in the midst of the trials. A new perspective in the midst of our pits that we find ourselves in, that we will always find ourselves in. This pit that seems like death, that seems like there is no life, like we're never going to climb out of this. Instead, it's a new perspective that says, no, I understand that God's got this, even though I may not see it. This comes from that idea that says that God paints on a canvas bigger than our eyes can behold. Vision for anything is limited to this. I can't see tomorrow. I can't see what's going to be. And in fact, I can't even see the past as clearly as I would like. But God can see it all. And He doesn't just see it in me, but He sees it in you and in this town and this county and this country and this world. And God can take it because He can see the whole picture, past, present, and future, and make it work out just the right way to make the greatest good. God can do this. This is why this is important to us. This is where we go from here. This is where we take it from here. To understand that even in our trials, we want to be better, not bitter. That we want to understand who God is and realize that His invisible hand is at work. To trust Him with it. And to change the way that we see trials. You know, the older I get, I need Jordan to come up here wherever he is. The older I get, the more I understand that faith is a choice, not a feeling. I think often we think that faith is a feeling. I think we think that how I feel about God and my trust for Him is just an emotional reaction. That I feel good about God, so therefore God's good today. Or I feel depressed or anxious or frustrated, therefore maybe God's not really there. And so often when we're in that pit, we just don't see where God is when we look at it just with our physical eyes. But faith is a choice. Faith is a choice. To say, I still will believe that God is good and loving and right, even if I don't see it right now. That even in the middle of the pit, I know the sun is still shining, even though I may not see it. In the middle of the storm, while the clouds and the lightning and the rain rush around me, I may not realize the storm will end, but the storm will end. And God will have been there the whole time, working all things out for good. That's what He promises in Romans 8:28. That all things will work together for good for those that love the Lord, who are called according to His purpose. And Joseph was called according to the purpose to save the nations. And yes, what did it mean? It meant Joseph had to be in the pit and in slavery. Can you turn him down a little, please? Had to be in the pit and in slavery and all of that. He had to be there so that he could come out on this end and be who God used to save the nations. But it's by faith and a trust, a personal choice to believe that God is still good, even in the middle of the darkness, even when we can't see it with our eyes. But God can be trusted in every situation. If you love Him and you know Him and you are His kid. It may not always work out exactly the way you want it to, but it will always be right. That's the difference in being surrendered to God and saying, I trust that you know better than me. And we know He says that. My ways, my thoughts, higher and better than yours. The question is, do you believe that that is true? And will you let your life be lived in such a way that it actually lives that out? That says, God, I trust you. Even though I may not see it, even though I may be in the pit, even though all hope is lost, I know there's still hope because of Jesus. Because of the promise, and the promises are true. But faith must rise above feelings, always. Especially in the midst of the storm. It's like that Mark 9 passage where the man comes to Jesus and he asked him, can you heal my son? And Jesus says, you just have to believe. And the man says, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. Maybe that's the story today for some of you. I believe, but help me in my unbelief. I trust you, but help me in my lack of trust. I have faith, but let it grow so that I can trust you even in the midst of the pit. Let me trust you, Father. Let me give my life to you. There's this poem by A.M. Overton that I just want to finish, and then I'm going to invite you to respond. Here's what it says. My Father's way may twist and turn. My heart may throb and ache. But in my soul, I'm glad I know He maketh no mistake. My cherished plans may go astray. My hopes may fade away. But still I'll trust my Lord to lead, for He doth know the way. Though night be dark, and it may seem that day will never break, I'll pin my faith, my all in Him. He maketh no mistake. There's so much now I cannot see. My eyesight's far too dim. But come what may, I'll simply trust and leave it all to Him. For by and by the mist will lift, and plain it all He'll make. Through all the way, though dark to me, He made not one mistake. It's time for us to trust despite our circumstances. Will you do that? Are you ready to let Him lead? Whether you're in the light or in the dark, in the good or the bad, in trial or in triumph, will you trust Him? If you want me to pray for you, I'll just go down here off the side. You can come down. I'll pray for you. But you, I hope, will worship in this moment and call on the name of the Lord, to give your life to Him, to put your life in His hands, and to trust Him with it. Father, I pray that we can do that in this moment, that each one here now will cry out to you, to trust you, to follow. That those who don't know you have had their eyes open to you, that you make no mistakes, that you are God and you are good, and that you have not forgotten us in our trials and our storms, but in the midst of the storm, your voice cries out to us.